to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today. I'm Allison Lindsay. So it's my great pleasure to welcome to the show today Susan Kaiser Greenland. Susan, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you here with me today, and I'm really looking forward to chatting to you. So just to introduce Susan, she developed the Inner Kids Mindfulness Awareness Program and teaches secular mindful awareness practices to children, parents, and professionals around the world. Inner Kids is a hybrid of classical mindfulness and meditation practices that have been adapted for children and one of the first mindfulness programs in education. She's played a major role in making mindfulness practices developmentally appropriate for young people and has written several books, including The Mindful Child and Mindful Games. She's developed a series of brief guided meditations for grown-ups entitled Mindful Parent, Mindful Child, and collaborated with the creators of the app Stop, Breathe, Think to develop an app for children called Stop, Breathe, Think Kids. Susan is also a founding faculty member of UCLA's Mindful Awareness Research Center's facilitator trainings. So Susan, I'm really happy to be talking to you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
And I guess let's just jump straight in. And the first thing I wanted to ask you about is really where your journey started with the body, with mindfulness and meditation. What prompted you to start learning mindfulness and meditation yourself?
Well, I was always interested in it. I mean, even as a child, I was interested in the idea of it. I just never had the discipline to practice meditation, but it always intrigued me. And then to make a very long story short, when I was pregnant with my son, who's 27 now, and my daughter was a toddler, and she's 29 now, my husband... and we just celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary yesterday or the day before, I think it was. Thank you. So he's just fine now. But at that time, he got diagnosed with a really lousy case of cancer, stage 4 lymphoma. Whoops, sorry. Let me silence that. And so when he got that diagnosis, I was working as a lawyer at the time, and I started researching what to do. And my guess is people think that the story is going to go to I landed on meditation, but I didn't. I landed on food and nutrition, and I became absolutely convinced that we were poisoning ourselves. So remember, I'm pretty pregnant at this point. We're living in New York City. I'm in a kitchen, like a relatively small kitchen, a New York City apartment, standing on a chair, grabbing every bit of food that's in the cupboard and reading the labels and tossing out most of it, convinced it's all poison, because it's got additives or this or that. Mm-hmm. And I remember my husband telling me that he had gotten a babysitter for that night because we were going to go and learn to meditate. And I wasn't so keen on taking the night off because I was really committed to this project and a little bit compulsive about it.
Yeah, it sounds like you were really on the roll with it.
I was on a roll with it and really, really, determined, which I can get still to this day. I can get that way. And, but then I thought, he's got cancer. He wants to learn to meditate. The least I can do is go. And I said something like that to him because I wasn't all that skillful in the moment. And he said, no, we're going because you need to learn to meditate because you're driving me crazy with all of this food stuff. So we went to the Zen Center and we took a 20-minute class in meditation, and then they took us downstairs, and then we sat and we practiced for a while, and I didn't make it through for more than a couple of minutes. I mean, I was just sitting there, and it was the first time I had allowed myself to be still with my thoughts and emotions, and I just went racing out of the room. And my husband stayed the full time, and when it was over, he looked around and, oh, where's my wife? And he came, and I was out on the outside, the Zen Center, just waiting for him. And that's how I started, but it wasn't smooth sailing. It took years. I then we ended up moving out of the city, moving to the country where we were able to have a less stressful lifestyle. And I started listening to audio tapes. At that point, they were on cassette tapes. And there were, Sharon Salzberg had a ton of loving kindness tapes. Joseph Goldstein had a couple early tapes, but I think it was even before his first book. And Jack Kornfield had his Path with Heart tapes. So I was listening to those cassette tapes at the time, and that's how I got started.
Was there something about the change in environment? You said you moved from New York out to the country. Do you think that helped? Do you think the frenetic, I love New York, but I haven't been there for a while, but was there something about that lifestyle that was contributing to making it difficult, do you think, or what happened?
We were certain that that lifestyle was not helping in the healing process. And we love New York too. We lived there for 20 years and now are looking forward to going back again. Our son is living in Brooklyn after the pandemic. He'll be back in Brooklyn. He's not there right now. But so we love New York, but we were absolutely convinced that just that whole vibe was not conducive to the healing process. So we left.
Amazing. And then it sounds like you were listening to a lot of things and practicing. How, I guess, easy or how bumpy did you find that ride creating your own sort of steady practice?
Oh, it was unbelievably bumpy. But I think it was very bumpy for a couple of reasons. The biggest one being when I decided to start, and that's not true for anyone, and I certainly don't want to discourage anyone from starting practice whenever they want to. But, one of the teachers I have a lot of admiration for and I'm friendly with is Alan Wallace. And I remember once him giving a talk and telling a story about a woman who came to him in a similar circumstance to when I came, how I started and how he helped her. But what was foremost on his mind is, geez, I wish you had come earlier. And that's one of the things we really practice with kids on a much less, grand scale as far as huge life events, which is really learning to practice and starting to integrate these practices into our lives when things are not emotionally charged. Because if you try to introduce these practices, whether it's kids when they're just upset about having spilt the milk or not getting invited to a birthday party, which can be a very traumatic event, or, an adult like me who is, holding a family together with a husband with a pretty lousy cancer diagnosis. If you try to start in those times of emotional charge, it's difficult. But if you have already a sense of what the theories are, a sense of the themes, some experience with the practice, some experience with the fact that it is always, under even the best of circumstances, up and down, then you're better able to draw upon those when you're in crisis. But of course, we are drawn to things when we're drawn to things, and crisis brings us places to get help. So certainly, I don't discourage anyone from starting wherever they are.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's often at those moments when things aren't going well, we start searching for the thing that's going to help us. But as you said, if you can get a steady practice, with a lot of the embodiment work I do with my clients, it's encouraging them to get a nice steady practice going so that it's available as a resource when they need it. I think that's absolutely key. And thank you for sharing that, because I know for myself, when I started meditating, it probably took me 3 or 4 years before I got a steady practice. I'd start, be really enthusiastic and then stop, and then I'd start again, and then I'd get discouraged. And I think it's a really common path for people. It's not an easy,
it's not a linear path. Yeah, under even the best of circumstances, it's not a linear path. I know, I've been practicing for a long time and sat many, many long retreats, and I know that this pandemic has been a difficult time for me to practice, partially because we, have a house full, and work during the pandemic is quite busy because of the need is so great with kids and families. And part of it is just all that's going on and the not knowing. So my capacity to easily just drop into my body and feel embodied and present is not what it was before the pandemic. I mean, I've taken a bunch of online retreats this summer. And so when I was practicing for extended period of time and in close online relationship to the teachings, it was much, much easier. But in the day-to-day, even for people like me and possibly for you too, when things get stressful, it's not as easy as it is when things are going smoothly.
Yes, and this is certainly a challenging time to be maintaining things. You think, oh, this is going to be really helpful. I was talking to someone recently, it was actually Mark Walsh, and he was saying, we were discussing how in normal times you have certain practices and they keep you going, and now you have to be doing almost like twice as much because you sort of get halfway through the day, you're like, oh, I'm depleted, I need to do something else, because this environment we're all in is so depleting for us all. So, but it sounds like the online retreats were a really good resource for you.
Oh, tremendous. I was so grateful, and I'm still so grateful for all of the teachers who made themselves so available this summer. And I think that we all learned something that it will be of benefit going forward, which is, I don't think that mindfulness training, well, look at what we're doing right now. This is all delivered online. And
yes.
And I think that mindfulness training, we did 150 classes in a course over 10 weeks of live Zoom
Wow.
classes with families. And we weren't sure whether that model was going to work, and it was just tremendously successful, and in some ways more successful and more accessible for both the teachers and for the students than it is to try to reach them out in person. I mean, of course, there's benefits in person, but it turns out there's also benefits in line, and we were really excited by seeing how these kids could engage with one another online through those
Yes.
kind of Brady Bunch squares. And we came up with some games to play in those squares that people could, the kids could relate with one another. And, there were people from all over the world in a class. So that was very cool for the kids. And so the online is affording us some opportunities that I think we might have figured out eventually, but we weren't ready yet, and this forced us into it.
It's forced us into creativity, hasn't it? What I'm feeling with my breath work, I was always like, no, it's hands-on, face-to-face, and now I'm offering it online. It works amazingly online. It's really surprising. I didn't think it would, but it does. And I'm guessing what I'm imagining is that some kind of hybrid model going forwards, and perhaps that's what you're seeing as well, that you can do both.
Yeah. I think so. So. So it's exciting to think of what is in the future.
Absolutely. So I wanted to take you back. You mentioned earlier that you started off as a corporate lawyer, and you spent a long time in that world, which is a pretty tough world to be in, I imagine. And it was whilst you were there that you actually developed the Inner Kids model. And I'd love you to just talk us a little bit about what inspired you. How did you bring that model together? What was that process there?
Well, remember, I had my kids, and we, once my husband got healthy again, we moved, instead of moving back into New York City, we actually moved to Los Angeles. So that's when we moved to LA. And then I was here, and it was easier to find a teacher. So I found a teacher whose name was Ken MacLeod, who teaches in the Tibetan tradition, who's a terrific teacher. And I was very fortunate to be around at a particular time that he was giving private instruction on a regular basis. So I had, I think at the time I had a toddler, a preschooler, and a first grader. And what I was working with mostly on Ken on the time were attention training practices and mind training practices. And at that time, there was nothing for kids. If I would Google meditation for kids, I found Dharma centers, Buddhist centers that had Buddhist programs, but nothing secular. And for our family, even though I am a practicing Buddhist, I practiced Buddhism for many, many years and study very seriously with Buddhist teachers. For our family, it wasn't a good match, the Dharma centers, although we did try, but it was a little too formal. I think it was so early on in the process then that, people were asking kids to sit with the adults for a really extended period of time. And it wasn't working with the ages of my kids and all. So So I decided I was going to start trying to see if I could modify some of what I was learning with Ken and practicing with Ken for kids. And that's how it started. And then I so enjoyed it that I ended up doing volunteering for first at the Boys and Girls Club in Santa Monica. And then later, a friend of mine had a classroom where he was a relatively new teacher, although a senior guy. He had changed careers. And he had been a producer of sorts. So we joked with him. It was like he was producing his classroom. He just had all of his friends come in and do things. He had somebody come in and do quilting. And he asked me to come in and teach mindfulness and meditation. So I started to do that. And that's how it started.
Fantastic. And when you talk to children about mindfulness and meditation, I'm curious, how do you describe them to them in a way that they can understand, that's clear?
Well, a bunch of different ways, and partially depending on the age, whether it's a young child or older elementary, middle school, or teenager. It's a little bit different, but basically it's paying attention with kindness and curiosity to ourselves, to other people, and to the world around us. And that pretty much covers it.
It's just a really simple kind of directional, get the attention going, and that's just an easy way for them to understand and follow what you're trying to share with them.
Well, that's the key. And we also have, it's funny because for these Zoom classes, I ended up going through my garage. I've done a lot of going through closets and garages in this pandemic, but especially for the Zoom classes. And I found a bunch of visual aids that I had created for these kids' classes way back in, the early 2000s, like 2005, 2006. And they were very simple. They were basic stick figures that just, with a big heart on the T-shirt of the person in the stick figure, and just paying attention with kindness and curiosity, and then self, other, in the world. And that kind of simplicity really is what helps with kids. And what was fun with the Zoom classes is I had some more of these visual aids created, trying to figure out what age group, what picture, what image works best with the ages. And I started to see how with the real little kids, even words like kindness can sometimes, and I'm talking about 3-4-year-olds, sometimes it doesn't quite land what that is. But if there's a picture of a heart on a T-shirt, on a child, on a visual aid, that gets it. See that heart? That's the kindness. So really bringing it down that simple. And what is amazing to me and remains amazing to me is how often these very, very simple tools, where you really distill it down to just its essence, it's kind of like homeopathy for, and that then lands with parents who had tried to meditate but found it too difficult for them. So and I'm sure you found this with your breath work as well, just the more we can really distill it down, offer it very simply, learn the basics, and then build from there, the more successful and beneficial the work tends to be.
Absolutely. I think the simplicity is always the key. The more you, as you say, the more you can break it down and just get down to the real underlying fundamentals. So do you find that the parents also are embracing mindfulness again, or in a different way when you're teaching their children? Who's encouraging who? Is it the parents encouraging the children, or the children encouraging the parents?
Well, it's a terrific circle of co-teaching and co-learning. And that is one of the things I love about this family-oriented work and school-based work as well. And I think it's one of the things that really has kept me going in this area for 20 plus years now, because we all learn together. So the parent might be in a family-based mindfulness. It's the parent who is trying to get the child into learn mindfulness. However, the parent often is really quite surprised that he or she is learning something too. Mm-hmm. And there's often a little bit of explanation that has to happen, that mindfulness classes aren't like piano or music lessons, for example, where you can bring in a piano teacher to have your child learn piano, but you don't really need to play the piano. The child can learn through the teacher. It's a very, very different experience in a family when both parent and child and everybody in the system begins to understand this process and this way of being in the world. And the same is true with schools. And in the school-based, what you often see is that the kids will take the mindfulness home, and the parents and some of the teachers too will start to think, what's going on? Something is changing here. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but what's changing here? And I'm really curious about this, and I want to follow through.
So it sounds like in the family-based programs that you're doing, it's very much that role modeling of the parents, and really, I guess, bringing it into everyday life for the children is one thing that's quite powerful.
Yeah.
And I know when I was actually looking at your book, I mentioned before we started that I actually bought your book, Mindful Games, earlier this year at the beginning of lockdown, because I was looking for ideas to use in my workshops. So I was very excited to be able to actually talk to you. And when in sort of reading it, I realised how much you're focusing on building specific skills around things like patience, appreciation, connection. So can you just talk a bit more about the themes that you've mentioned attention already, but some of the other themes and how you bring them to life for children?
Sure. And thank you for noticing that, because that's a very, very important piece of the work that I think is crucial and often overlooked. I think often people focus on attention and executive function and self-regulation and mindfulness as that, and kind of stopping there. Mm-hmm. And that certainly is important. And it almost does have to come first, because it's very difficult for us to have the bandwidth to consider big picture issues when our nervous systems are all revved up and we've got that speedy kind of energy going. That actually limits our capacity to be able to think broadly. But for me, that is not only remarkably limited, it is just a sliver of the whole picture of what mindfulness and compassion is and does. And so these themes, I think, are crucial and also, really transformative. And those are universal themes that do come out of classical mindfulness and meditation training, classical contemplative training, but they also come out of all sorts of other, solid disciplines, whether it's education, whether it's philosophy, whether it's science, whatever. And they're things like acceptance, learning to accept, which of course doesn't mean learning to give up, so these things have to be really carefully explained. Things like open-mindedness, the capacity to hold competing thoughts in mind at the same time without having to jump to judgment on one or the other. I mean, if we can start teaching our kids and helping them to do that, I think there'd be a huge shift in just our political system right now. I mean, that's one of the things that we're seeing is so much tribalism. And that in and of itself will be shifted by when people practice mindfulness and meditation and start to better understand things like interconnectedness, how we're all connected to one another, things about causes and conditions, things about the limitations on what we know. And if we become more comfortable accepting what we do know and how little we know, both at the same time, how that actually is a bit of a relief. And it also allows us then to be more present and able to listen and consider other points of view. It doesn't mean we're going to agree with the other point of view, but very often we just stop ourselves from even really looking at it from a critical standpoint and from all sides. So these themes to me are extremely important. And they also are what makes this work just infinitely interesting.
You mentioned earlier on, and I was thinking about the connection here, and you mentioned earlier on about the loving kindness practices that you were doing. And I wondered if perhaps you had a short practice or something that perhaps you do with some of the children you could share with us, so we can get a sense of perhaps how you're bringing the connection, the loving kindness to life for them.
Sure. We call it friendly wishes. We don't call it loving kindness because we found that kids didn't really understand the phrase loving kindness too much. And also in some, I've become very sensitive to different types of language that is controversial or triggering to certain groups, and that there are some groups, particularly in the very conservative Christian traditions, who find loving kindness practices to be extremely problematic. But when we reframe them to be friendly wishes, that we are just wishing good thoughts, kind thoughts to our friends, that is something that kids, first, again, remember, we're talking about being very concrete. They understand that, okay, I have a friendly wish for my mom or for my dad. Mm-hmm. So that's very concrete for the kids. And it also doesn't imply some kind of mystical, magical sending of energy here, there, and the other place, which is something that some people find problematic. So friendly wishes is what we call them. And we just, again, go through the same sequence that we were talking about with mindfulness, is paying attention with kindness and compassion to ourselves, others, in the world. For the little kids, we start with friendly wishes for ourselves, and then other people, and then the world around us. And as kids get a little older, we'll add friendly wishes for people who bug us or people who get on our nerves, which is a very, very useful. It's a bit harder, but it's an extremely useful practice for siblings.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in this sense of really thinking about the language that you're using, which I think can be incredibly important. I mean, certainly cross-culturally, as you're saying, with different demographics within a nation, just making sure that taking that very secular approach and making it much more accessible to everybody. It sounds really important.
Yeah. It's certainly important to me, and it has proven to be helpful in all of the work that we've done. And I think if we put ourselves in other people's shoes and walk in their shoes, it makes sense. It's the respectful thing to do. And then, of course, very specifically, we want to be using words that kids understand. And we also want to be using words that adults don't find jargony. So a lot of words that in the meditation community we think of as we truly understand what they mean, to people from the outside, they're a little head scratching and sometimes called jargoning. So for real little kids with friendly wishes, because I know you were asking about practices, remember we also try to embody them. Yes. I think this is the embodiment conference, so that's a good thing to remember. And we try to bring in physical movement as well, because that so many of our kids and adults, honestly, get a little bit antsy sitting still. So it's good to have some movement. So we start by giving ourselves an imaginary hug. So we give ourselves a little hug, and often we encourage kids to move back and forth. And then while they are hugging themselves, giving themselves an imaginary hug, they can close their eyes if they like, and just bring a picture to their mind of themselves in a place where they're happy and healthy. They have everything that they need, and they feel peaceful and calm and lots and lots of love. Then we just extend our hands a little bit and think about giving a hug to somebody else. So, and this is great in family mindfulness. If you have a parent or a caregiver in the Zoom frame or in the room, you can actually give the hug to the parent or the caregiver, and you give a hug to somebody you love. And again, you imagine wishes you have for that person. What do you wish? You wish that and in the classical tradition, we wish things like love and peace and ease. But with little kids who are very concrete thinkers, we don't discourage them from wishing things like, I really wish that you get that promotion that you were looking for, Mom, or I really wish, Dad, that you're able to win that golf tournament that you're in. I mean, that was a sexist, gendered decision there on choice. But so, Mom, I wish you are success in your golf tournament. Let's put it that way. And Dad, I wish you success in making this angel food cake recipe. They can be very, very specific, these wishes that we have. Then we extend it more. We make our arms a little bit wider. And then we think of people in the community that we can add into this group hug. And then we have wishes for them. So they can be wishes for friends. I wish that you have lots of fun today. I wish that you are very, very happy. I wish that you are able to see your friends and get some play dates, those kind of things, especially during the pandemic. Those were a lot of the wishes we heard. And we also heard during the pandemic a lot of wishes from the kids saying, I wish you would wear your mask correctly.
Wow.
The number of kids who were commenting on, I wish you would wear a mask in general, and I wish you would not put it over your nose and not just your mouth. I mean, this was coming from the children, not from the parents. And I was just not surprised, but always impressed and kind of blown away by it. And then last, we stretch our arms out wide and we imagine hugging the globe. And can you imagine wishes and giving the whole planet? And can you imagine a planet where absolutely everybody is happy and healthy and safe and has everything they need and all the food to eat and all the medicine that they need? So and then again on the planets, we heard a lot from the kids about the rainforest and the dolphins and all sorts of things that are on their minds. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to have those conversations in the context of practice.
So it sounds like a real sparking point as to what do we mean? What are the conversations we want to have as a family, as a community, as a country, and just really getting the children involved. And I love the fact that you do concrete things with them, because I guess it's getting the principles for them, and as they get older they can develop the different understandings that perhaps as adults we might have of loving kindness or friendly wishes. Right. But I really like friendly wishes. I may borrow that from you.
Oh, welcome to.
Because occasionally I do breath classes with children, and that sounds like a really nice thing to Well, I love these concrete conversations with kids and with teenagers, and frankly with parents too, because it's where everything starts. If we start with the theoretical, first of all, developmentally, the little kids aren't there yet. They don't yet have the developmental capacity to understand some of these big words, unless if they're really broken down for them. But also for adults, if we start with the theoretical too soon, we can get caught up in concepts that really are not consistent with necessarily what we're saying, or it's all in our head and not in our body at all. But if we start with something very specific that is coming from them, as opposed to coming from the outside, then we tend to be able to get a little bit more of a felt sense, a visceral sense of what we mean. And with that, we can build. From that, we can build.
From the interview to tell you about our shop and a deal we've got on there, and also about some events that are coming up. So if you go to embodiedfacilitator/shop and use the code podcast50 is the code, you can get 50% off anything in the shop. And what have we got on there? How to design training, trauma for facilitators, breath work, leadership, resilience, life purpose. There's a bunch of books, there's a bunch of e-courses, mostly for facilitators, trainers, coaches, yogis, different ebooks. But that code will give you 50% out off anything at all there in the shop. So that could save you, let's say, up to £100, which is about $120. So well worth having that code. Go to embodiedfacilitator.com/shop. Also on that website, you will see embodiedfacilitator.com/events-calendar. Just look under events under the main title. You'll see all the stuff we've got coming up for events. We regularly have free online events. If you're interested in embodiment, we have them on coaching, life purpose, marketing, all trauma, all sorts of things. So have a look at the events page. You can see the different one-day events we've got coming up related to the conference and all kinds of other stuff. Okay, so all of that is on embodiedfacilitator.com. And remember that code there. That code is podcast50 if you want 50% off anything. There you go. A good deal. Back to the interview.
So you're really grounding it in the real world and things that make sense to them first, and then going, okay, where do we go from?
Yeah.
I'm curious, you've mentioned there about making them developmentally appropriate, and I know that you did a lot of work with that. I guess I'm curious as to what informed your thinking. Was there any research you were doing, or was it based on your own experience? How did you gauge that as you were doing that?
Well, in two different ways. I mean, although my degree is as a lawyer, I don't have a degree in education. My mother was a kindergarten teacher, and my sister's a 30-year classroom teacher. I come from a family of teachers. I kind of know why I didn't get an education degree, but I regret it a little bit now. However, I was and have been unbelievably fortunate that in my years of really classroom work, I basically was a student teacher in many respects in some terrific classrooms with a bunch of terrific directors and school directors. And so it was a combination of my own trial and error and my own study and meditation and and all of the work that I was doing with teachers, because they would be in the classroom while I was teaching. They were always part of the school, of the circle. And then there was a good number of years, especially in the preschool area, where I was working with a particular school, and Gabe Harwin was the director of that school, and she's retired now. And she and I would meet once a week and go through what was working and what wasn't working. So it was through that process of trial and error that I really got to understand what was landing. And then, of course, there's plenty of books that I have read and continue to read, and some great books that just outline basically developmentally where kids are at a particular age. And I strongly suggest that any parents who are interested in this kind of work do get some general, really basic books on, what to expect at first grade, what to expect second grade, what to expect in third grade. I think it's helpful with the meditation, but I think it's helpful with just raising kids, because what I have seen, the Zoom classes allowed me this summer to really get in there and start working with kids again, which was extraordinary and so much fun. And I will carry that into the fall. But mostly for the last 10 years, I have not been working with children as much, although I've been working with them some, and I've been supervising or training teachers. And what I have found in going in and watching teachers teach mindfulness, even teachers who do have education degrees, is that very frequently they were leading practices that were a bit over the kids' heads, or leading them in such a way that it would be very, very tough for the kids to understand what was being talked about. So I think there's a lot of good resources out there for people to take a look at.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're doing amazing work getting it into schools. As you say, you're training the teachers. But have you had any resistance at all to bringing mindfulness into schools? Or I just wonder how you overcame
sure.
that.
Yeah. And in some ways the resistance has eased, and in some ways the resistance has increased. There's been more resistance from conservative Christian organizations just in general. So there is that, but that hasn't really stopped anything from happening in my world. But there's different kinds of resistance. There's resistance to spending time on this when school time is so limited, and the thought is that it takes away from, the hard, reading, writing, arithmetic type things. So, and then there's just some parents who just plain don't like it. But what I have found is, and I continue to work in this way, and it's very different from some of the large programs out there. I work very small. I always encourage schools to start small. I'm much more interested in working with small groups of people who have bought in or who are curious.
Yes.
And what I have found since the very beginning, and we're now talking, as I said, over 20 years now, that usually if you have just one parent and or just one teacher who is curious about this, and they find a way in whatever system, whether it's a community or it's a school, to offer this in an authentic, somewhat humble way, not as an evangelist, but just this is something I'm doing in my classroom or I'm doing as an after school. And they start to figure out how to do it within that particular culture, then there tends to be a ripple effect. What happens is teachers who are very, very resistant starts thinking, something's going on there and I'm interested and I want to give it a try too. It's a longer haul. It takes more time. But that to me is how you really see kind of system-wide change in schools and in communities, as opposed to coming in with a big program on the outside and trying to slap it on.
Trying to force it in, yes.
Yeah. And
so
that way I haven't faced that much resistance because I, if somebody is resistant, I don't try to change their minds. I don't intentionally try to change their minds. One of the themes, they're talking about universal themes before. One of the themes that I teach kids and parents and teachers is to drop the rope. The idea is, and this comes out of a classical idea, the backwards law, and that sometimes, or the law of reverse effect, sometimes the harder we try, the less likely we are to succeed, or the less positive results we have. So when I'm really faced with resistance, I'll certainly respond and I'll be present. I won't back down, but I do drop the rope. I don't push back. And that can, if the drop the rope is a reference like to tug of war, and that can sometimes, really affect in a very positive way. It's like, that I didn't expect that to happen. And the person who's still pulling often loses their footing. So that's how I deal with resistance. And I recognize I'm in a fortunate position because I've been doing this for so long and the need is so great. If I lose a client, it feels to me like that's okay. That's what was supposed to happen. And there is other work to take its place. So I recognize younger teachers may not be in the same boat that I am.
But I think you're right. Once we start forcing things onto people, then it's a different game, and they're not then coming into it with, I guess, the wholeheartedness and the open-mindedness that we're looking for. But
and it's not just a different game. It's inconsistent with what we're teaching.
Yes,
that's the key with this mindfulness work, is that, and it's so tricky, given it is we're trying to bring it into a system where there is certain goal orientation and striving and result orientation. But if we just adopt that hook, line, and sinker, then we're completely undercutting what it is we're teaching in our classes, because kids and parents, but especially kids, they've got a nose for authenticity. And so if we're teaching one thing and doing something else, we might as well give it up right then and there.
Yes, completely undermined ourselves. But you were saying that when one teacher goes into it kind of wholeheartedly and the others start to notice something's happening. Do you have any stories or anecdotes you can share of success stories where people have seen real change?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember one school I worked with very early on where exactly that happened. I mean, there was tremendous resistance, but one teacher, I think it was a second grade teacher, agreed to allow an outside mom who was interested in mindfulness to come in and start working with her class. And by the end of, I don't know if it was 1 or 2 school years, every single classroom was doing some aspect of mindfulness training in their classroom. So there is that. And then for me, the real victories are when I see the changes in how people begin to respond to day-to-day experience. When you start to see people just express more appreciation and gratitude without sweeping under the rugs the really lousy things that are happening right now. But when you start to see people feel far more open-minded, and even very early on in these programs with little kids, you get anecdotal, sorry, let me silence that. You get anecdotal stories about kids being on the playground and saying things like, okay, just stop and take a breath right now, and starting to do their own conflict resolution with just, let's stop and breathing there. Or another fun story is parents driving in the car, getting in a fight in the front seat, and the child in the back seat starting to sing the breathing song, or parents getting stuck in traffic and getting all worked up, and the children singing some songs or giving people advice from the backseat to just stop. It's okay, Mom, just stop, take a couple breaths. It's going to be fine. So you hear those kind of stories come back really, really early on in the kids' training.
That is absolutely fantastic. I love it. Yeah, so much from children. They see things more easily than us sometimes, I think. One thing I was curious about is if you've worked with any children with neurodiversity, like ADHD or any particular groups like that. I work with a lot of adults, actually, in the workplace, and I'm curious as to how some of these practices might help them or might translate at all.
Yeah. No, I've certainly, especially early on, I did a lot of work with kids who were on the less regulated side of the attention spectrum. And then when you're in a classroom, there are often children with neurodiversity, and there's children with shadows and other sorts of support. And so I've done a lot of work with kids in groups that are already established. I have not chosen to do work very specifically with a specific, intervention for a specific type of neurodiversity. That said, it doesn't really. My experience is working with kids on either side of any spectrum. The approach is the same, and the approach really is to just be with the child right there as they are right now. And that's why it is so important that teachers are so well trained. And that's why the programs that are more cookie cutter programs where on Monday you do this, on Tuesday you do that, on Wednesday you do something else, and people have maybe a weekend training, maybe a little online training, and then they get a packet and then they get to go out. I think there's a place for those programs, and I think that there is a benefit because it is a way in. But I also see the downside, because what really we need to be doing with these children, regardless of what we're teaching them, is to be able to be present with what is emerging in the moment. And this is true with adults as well. And to have a nice, hefty toolbox of different ideas and practices in games that we can pull out to try different things to see what's actually going to land at that moment, and to have enough experience ourselves, both with the kids and also with the practice, with our own personal practice, so that we have internalized and integrated some to a lot of this, that we know when to stop, that we're comfortable just letting it go, that we know that it's time to take a break and that it's okay to take a break, and that we also don't get alarmed when certain feelings come up, and that we're not scared by those feelings, but also we recognize, okay, so something is happening here that's a little different than what we've experienced before. And so by having the experience ourselves, hopefully we also have some sort of a support network that we can reach out to and talk to and kind of pass these ideas around, or toss ideas around, to see what is the best way to re-engage. So I really like that answers your question.
I was going to say, I really like this notion of being absolutely present with what's arising in the moment. And it's, even as an adult, it's one of the hardest things, where our heads are always either in the past or in the future, or mine is, it seems to be. So just getting really present sounds really important.
Yeah, I think it is.
I was wondering if you had something, it's during the podcast, sometimes we share some, actually we do like a short practice or something, and I wondered if you had perhaps a body-based practice you could share with us that would help people to just experience, if they want to get really present with their child and just get into the moment. Is there something you could share with us, Susan?
Sure. A really easy thing to do that is very body-based with children, and remember, it varies depending on the age of children. But if your child is game to do this, unfortunately, I can't lead you through it, but I can describe it.
Absolutely.
Is if you are sitting here, so let's say you're sitting here, if you're able to sit cross-legged on the floor, great. So if you're sitting cross-legged on the floor here, and this is your back, and you have the child sit cross-legged on the floor here, and this is his or her back, and you sit back to back, so your backs are touching. And then if you like, you can sort of combine elbows and hold, and then you synchronize your breathing. And you just breathe together. And remember, as the adult, you really try to synchronize your breathing with the child as opposed to the other way around, and really get a sense of what that's like to breathe together. And then once you have a sense of that, that's something you can carry with you as a bedtime ritual. I mean, one of the things I remember this both when my children were very young and when my parents were ill and dying. Just the capacity to be able to stay with them and to breathe with them and really synchronize your breathing to them, and that this process has a very strong regulating effect. So again, we're regulating and co-regulating one another. So even though we may be the ones who are synchronizing our breathing to the child or the adult, the fact is that the child is regulating us as well. That process is also regulating us.
That sounds like it's tapping in a little bit to the polyvagal theory about the co-regulation and that creation of safety that we have when we're co-regulating with each other.
Yeah.
Really interesting practice. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
And assuming people are getting a practice going with their children, how do they keep them engaged? How do they keep it so that they can really integrate it into their children's lives, into their family lives, so that it becomes a real resource for them?
Yeah, well, again, we have to have realistic expectations. You know, we think about our own practice and how we may have a lot of aspirations, but how often do we actually follow through? So again, we have to be realistic about kids. But the general idea of short moments, many moments throughout the day, and this idea of dropping brief moments of awareness in throughout the day. So there's all sorts of things we can do. We can put, like we have some doorknob holders we'll put on the kids, or doorknob hangers we'll put on kids' doors that say, remember to take a breath, or, something, or send a friendly wish, or what are you grateful for right now? And really just dropping in those simple prompts in throughout the day go a long, long way. And then often having a nighttime ritual, a bedtime ritual, or a ritual at the dinner table or the breakfast table, at some time during the day, but choosing a couple points where you have a ritual that we still to this day have a ritual of a gratitude practice, or just saying something great they're grateful for before every dinner. And it just becomes part of the fabric and part of the view of the family. So that sort of thing. And then being available for the children when they are interested in diving in a little bit deeper. And last, but probably most important, is this idea of your own practice, of really developing your own practice first. And having your own practice, having your children see you practice. So that doesn't mean we don't need to always go off in a corner and practice on our own, although sometimes we need that time to do. But also having people just sit and practice for a second. Just take a brief moment and a few breaths and model that. Mommy's mind is a little bit worked up right now. Can you just hang out with me for a second? I'm going to take 3 deep breaths. Will you take them with me? 1, 2, 3. And that's it. And what you're doing there, 1 is you're using that opportunity to settle yourself. And 2 is you're modeling how these ideas actually work in daily life.
So these really become skills for life, and everything you're describing are all things that as adults are equally useful for us. Having ritual in our day, having those regular moments. I love the idea of the prompts, what are you grateful for? Just something up around the house, just to remind us regularly, just to pause a moment. Life gets pretty frantic. So just have that moment, as you say, to breathe and just go, okay.
Yeah.
How am I?
Yeah. And Post-its are very helpful. We had something when our kids were growing up, everybody was like trying to get out the door to get to school or work. But we stopped at the front door and we took a few deep breaths. And you could put a Post-it on the refrigerator saying, take a breath, or take 3 breaths before you open the refrigerator. Any place that people often are. Just building in this pause, this kind of mindful interrupter, an interruption of your usual routine. And that in and of itself, little by little, starts to change, the pace, and starts to help with our reactivity, because that is one of the places we see huge benefits with kids very, very early on, is the decrease in just reactivity, the ability to just stop even for an instant. And that goes a long, long way.
So that opportunity then to pause and choose, how am I going to respond, rather than just instantly reacting in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I put another beat in there too. Pause and feel. Yeah. Pause and just note what's happening here. What's happening in my body and what's happening in my mind. I mean, I had craziest thing happen to me. It's so this practice is so humbling. I've been doing it for over 20 years now in a very serious way. Close to 30 years in a less serious way. And, the other day we had a scare, and everything is fine, but a scare when my son was in the emergency room. So I get in the car, and of course it's COVID, which means you can't get into the emergency room. But I wanted to be able to find a way to at least connect with the doctor. I get in the car, and I was driving quite fast, for me anyway. And I knew that I was not in my body. I mean, I had this thought over and over again, Susan, you're not in your body. Susan, you're not in the body. I did not stop. I did not settle. And I, with this knowledge that I wasn't in my body, completely, ran over a curb, got a flat tire, and I ended up on the side of the road needing to call AAA and didn't get myself to the emergency room. Everything turned out fine, and he is fine. But I was sitting there in my car waiting for the AAA, which is the roadside service, to come. And I thought, this is just so humbling. What do I do for a living? What do I teach? And I knew that I wasn't, I knew that I was like kind of having this out of body experience, and I still didn't integrate what I teach. And so it's just learning this thing, just this awareness. Once we are aware of something, it may not actually change, but our relationship to it is forever changed.
Yeah. So even with the awareness, we still have to make the choice as to what we're going to do. You were aware you weren't in your body, and you chose to ignore it. Consequences. I'm glad everything was okay with your son.
Well, and then the gratitude practices come in. So I'm sitting there waiting for AAA, just deeply, deeply grateful that the worst thing that happened is I got a flat tire, that I hit a curb, that I didn't hit somebody else. I mean, so all of this does really just jive together, once we really start to look at those themes that you were talking about early on and integrate them.
It sounds like it was an amazing experience in terms of reflecting and seeing what was going on, even if in the moment it didn't go quite the way you'd planned, but in terms of the learning from that. And I think I've also had occasions like that when you're like, I saw that was happening. Why did I not do that? But that is part of the learning and reflection. Yeah.
And the humility, and it really does make you humble. And it's also, I think we remember where we are right now as a global community. This pandemic, everybody has a completely other layer of stress on top of the ordinary stress that now the pandemic's been going on so long, we often don't factor that in. And I know for myself that the pandemic alone has not only affected my capacity to be able to hold strong, big emotions without reacting to them and with a sense of humor, it has truly affected the capacity of almost everybody, if not everybody, that I'm working with or that I'm coaching or that I'm mentoring or in my family unit or my friends. So being able to hold all this in mind and have some humility and a sense of humor and, of course, some compassion for ourselves and give ourselves a break over it, those are the things that come through daily practice and consideration, reflection on these themes.
Yeah. And so, as you say, certainly at the moment, the more compassion for ourselves and others we can have, that level of stress has become normalized in a way that isn't normal. But you're right, it's kind of there as a layer, and we've almost stopped noticing it. It's starting to become a bit ingrained. So we'll see how that shifts, I guess, over time as the pandemic goes on. So, Susan, I'm just curious, we're coming towards the end of our time together, but I'm curious about what's next for you. You've told us this amazing journey that you've had, and that you've moved from very much being with the children and now teaching teachers, and then over through the pandemic going back to teaching or being more engaged with the children, which sounds like a wonderful thing. So where do you see things going forwards? What's your kind of hope for the future?
Oh, I'm just really lucky, and I've been lucky for the few years that I really don't look that far ahead anymore. Again, that's another one of these things that we learn through practice. I don't have, I work very hard, but I don't have a lot of expectation, tied to that. Mm-hmm. So I will continue to do what I do. I will start doing some online work with kids, more, just fit it more into my routine.
Yeah.
I love it. It gives me such joy. And it's also a way to reach people that I couldn't otherwise reach. But I'll continue to work the way I have been working, which is, training teachers who come and would like to be trained, and working with parents and that sort of thing. And I have another book that I'm working on. So it's just those kind of projects, but without a grand plan around building this or mindfulness in every home or with every child. I would love to see all of that happen, and I'm seeing it happen more and more now that there's so many people out there doing good work. But I have found, as the years go on, just a tremendous sense of quiet and relief in learning, which I learned through my teachers, my meditation teachers, Mingyur Rinpoche and Soni Rinpoche are my primary teachers, to be able to let go of expectation and to still keep working, to still keep doing, but just to then let the music play and let it play out. And the suffering comes from the planning and the expectation much more than, the challenges and the doing. So long way of saying I have no plan for anything other than what I'm already doing. And I feel so very grateful to be able to do it.
Fantastic. So just two last questions. Firstly, where can people find you online if they want to find out more about what you're doing, about the books? You've got the new book coming out. What's the new book? Are you able to tell us or not?
Yeah, it's called Everyday Enlightenment, or at least that's the working title. And it's around these themes that you mentioned.
Okay.
It's a series of essays around these themes. And they will be sequenced in the way that I teach them. So, or I present them to kids and families and other caregivers. So I'm excited about that book. It'll be a while before it's done, but it's fun in the writing. The best way to reach me is through my website, susankaisergreenland.com. You can sign up for a newsletter. I send out newsletters. I used to send them very regularly. That too is easing up a little bit, but the newsletters are always practice-based with specific videos and audios and things we think you'd like to know about other programs that are going on in the field. I like to be able to use that as a way to promote field development. And then I'm on all of the social media platforms. Just you can follow my name, find my name, and you'll find me there.
Perfect. Thank you. And then just, I guess, any last comments or thoughts, anything that you would say to encourage people and their children to get more into mindfulness meditation?
Yeah, just have fun with it. Just think of it not as another thing for your to-do list, but as something that actually can be playful fun and a way to connect with one another. So a lot of people come to this practice because they're trying to fix something and that they need help on something. And it is useful for that. So I'm not discouraging that, but then that sometimes loses just the playful quality and the enriching quality. And so that's what I would say. And just start with small things that actually resonate for you. Mostly for the adults, what I would say, practice yourself and see what works for you. Because remember, all of these practices really land with different people differently based on how people are wired and their personality types. So that's why the classical contemplative practices, like teachers like the two teachers I just named, Soni and Mingyur Rinpoche, they talk about how different practices work with different personality types and different experiences. The same practice, different personality types will have a different experience. So we can really draw from these contemplative practices and recognize that's true with our kids too, and true with us. So I had one teacher years and years ago who was new to meditation. like very new to meditation. She was a preschool teacher. And she just kind of got a sense of breath awareness, kind of got a sense of how breath awareness can just help her lower her shoulders. Mm-hmm. And she really wanted to share this with the kids, but she didn't know much more than that yet. Now she's actually quite a senior mindfulness teacher and, does wonderful work in schools. But it was the very beginning. I said, just stay with that. Just teach what you know. Just talk to the kids about what your experience is. And that's how she started. And she really landed with her preschoolers. So for adults, try a bunch of different things. See what feels right to you. See where you get a visceral, embodied sense of a shift. And then share that.
That sounds like the perfect place to finish our interview, with a visceral, embodied sense of what works for you. So thank you so much, Susan. It's been a real pleasure to meet you. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved. The biggest request that we have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it. We would really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Embodiment Podcast and give us $1 an episode. That's less than £1 if you're in the UK, so please go there. The podcast is hosted on the embodiedfacilitator.com website, although most people listen to it from iTunes. In iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way that iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help us. Thank you. And if you want to go to the embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual links to the site. There's comments on there. And there's also a Facebook group, which tends to be where people discuss things. So just put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook and you'll find the page. It's relatively quiet, but the group does have some discussion on it and will reply to things personally there. Also on the website, you'll find all sorts of freebies. There's free videos, free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy, and of course, there is our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course, our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so those are the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook page. Pick whichever one works best for you. Thank you.